This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. As always, thank you to our current group of subscribers, now at an astonishing 996. We are less than 5 away from 1,000 here on the YouTube channel. Thank you so much for subscribing, and if you're a first timer, be sure to like and subscribe and help us break 1K. Before we get started with today's Critical Thought, I finally finished Bloodborne the other night. Late in the morning, I was able to finally beat the game, and I can now say I have conquered Soulsborne, although I haven't done the DLC yet, so that will certainly be an interesting test when we get there. Now, what that means for you folks is, now that I've finished essentially the Let's Break content, I can do some more general play of the game on the Twitch stream, so be sure to look for that in the coming days and possibly tonight. Now, let's get to today's Critical Thought. We're going to be talking about the topic of scaling when it comes to game design. And I can tell you right away, we're not going to be covering everything in today's Critical Thought. There's just way too many facets and topics relating to this one to get into. But if you have any suggestions or things you want me to cover, be sure to let me know in the comments below. For today's Critical Thought, we're going to be focusing on two kinds or two elements of scaling: player scaling and a mechanic or progression based scaling. And I want to start with player scaling because it should be the easier of the two to talk about. When I'm referring to player scaling, this is the concept that a game is designed around multiple or even just one person playing it. One of the challenges of building a game that's built around either a PvE or co-op and single player is deciding just what is the baseline of the game. And I don't think I've actually dedicated a Critical Thought to discussing the concept of baseline, and I really should fix that soon. But just to get on the same page, the baseline is essentially the standard or the bare minimum of what it takes to play your game. And again, if we start getting more into that, we'll be here for another 30 minutes. But when it comes to games that are built on single or multiple players at the same time, it's about understanding what is essentially going to be your core experience. Is your game meant to be played with one person? Is it meant to be played with 3, 5, 10, 30, 80, you name it? And what this is about the challenge of is what happens when you have more or less players than your baseline. And this is where the concept of scaling a game to the players come into play. In some cases, this could mean increasing enemy health, increasing their damage, could be having more enemies, could be having less enemies if there are less than the baseline. In the Souls series, for instance, we all know that the more blue phantoms or the more players you bring in to help you with a fight, the more health the boss will have in return. And with other games, the challenge becomes either building your game around this baseline or compensating for it. Now, with that said, there are some unusual exceptions. There are games that are built exclusively for a specific number of players. Left 4 Dead being one, Payday 2 being another one, even something like Warhammer Vermintide could be an example. These are games where they are expecting a bare minimum number of participants. Left 4 Dead, it's 4 players to co-op, 8 for versus, Payday 2 4, Vermintide 4 again. Then you said Vermintide, there we go. And what they do is, when you're talking about scale in this regard, you always need to compensate. The problem is, as we talked about I think in an earlier Critical Thought about AI design, we are not at the point yet where we can have an AI enemy or an AI player be better or equal to a human player. We're basically starting to get into like Terminator and, robot apocalypse talk there. And the other point is for game balance. If the AI is better than a human, why should you ever play co-op or multiplayer? But when you have games along this kind, it's important to, if you're not going to compensate by the AI, you have to compensate via scaling. And that is one of the harder things to do. If you're going to make the game easier, you have to make it so that it's still approachable. A good example of this would be something like Orcs Must Die 2, and even Orcs Must Die Unchained, which I played. The game allows you to play either in single player or co-op for the maps. The problem is, past like the first 2 or 3 maps, they are all designed around a co-op experience. And you can tell simply by how the maps are laid out. They are very wide playing fields with 3+ lanes. And you cannot corral enemies in between lanes. And I actually want to dedicate a critical thought about tower defense design, so I want to come back to that one. But the point is, this is not designed for one person. Even if you give the player like 3 or 4 times the number of resources, they still can't be in 3-4 places at the same time. And this is an example of a game that's kind of going in the wrong direction for scaling. It's simply built for multiplayer, but they're trying to present this as a single player or a single experience at a time. Typically, when we're talking about scaling when it comes to the number of players, it's about building your baseline around less players rather than more. Now, with cases like Payday 2 and Left 4 Dead, it's another one of those very interesting exceptions to that rule, because they are designed first and foremost as multiplayer games. If you're going to go along that front, then you need to make multiplayer as easy and as seamless as possible to get into. And talking about multiplayer architecture, once again, that's going to be another critical thought at some point. A good example of basically what the failure of Orcs Must Die Unchained is, would be games that start from a single player and then scale up for multiplayer. And there's 2 really good examples for that. Portal 2 and Lara Croft and the Guardian of Life. I think Life or Light. Now I don't remember, it's been a while. Portal 2 obviously has its entire single player story campaign. So what they did was build an entirely different co-op campaign. Completely different story, completely different puzzles, and completely different solutions for playing it. So in this way, if you want to play the game single player, you are more than able to. If you want to do multiplayer, you have something different to do. Now, Lara Croft is a really great example, and it's such a great example, it's also not one that's entirely feasible for every game. What they did in the game was, you can essentially play the game in 3 different ways. You can either play it as Lara Croft, you can play it as the Aztec guy who joins you, or you can play it co-op. And the game's puzzles will literally change depending upon who you're playing as, or if you're playing multiplayer. And I mean that literally. They redesigned all the puzzles in the game for a single player or for multiplayer. And that is amazing. It allows you to essentially have 3 games in one, and it makes it so that you are never being punished if you have too few people, if you're only playing by yourself. If you want to play multiplayer and then go back to single player, the game will seamlessly transition between these 3 modes. And that's another major point about this kind of player scaling, is that good player scaling will usually adjust the game on the fly. If a player joins in, the enemies grow stronger. If players leave, enemies grow weaker. And yes, if you've watched like the Diablo 3 plays, you know that is also another really good example of it. Now, one last thing about player scaling before we move on, because if we don't, we'll be here for a very long time, is that if you're going to go the route of forcing multiple people to play, or have huge groups of players in order to play your game, it's always important again to have those compensations for if there aren't players. This is very important for games that struggle to have a multiplayer community, because it creates almost a negative feedback loop. If you can't, you need people to play your game so you have a community so that you don't have to worry about scaling. But if people don't play your game because they can't find people or the game doesn't scale well, then they're not going to stick around, which means you don't have a community, which means that there won't be people around to grow it, and then the scaling won't work, and it just has sunk many multiplayer games. And again, it's always great, or as a basic tip, you should always build your baselines around the bare minimum players. That could be 1, it could be 4, but that has to be your experience, and then that needs to be communicated. I think Payday 2 could probably do a little bit better than that in that regard, in my opinion, by the fact that it still allows you to play any of the difficulty levels, even with the AI. And I'm sorry, but I'm not seeing a player, at least without using some very powerful mods, beating One Down or Death Wish by themselves in a loud heist. But that's another story altogether. Now, we're already about 10 minutes in, so talking about mechanic scaling, we may not hit it all today, but let's see if we can do it. When referring to scaling in terms of mechanics and design, we're referring to essentially, again, that progression curve of gameplay and difficulty. The game should be becoming more enemies should be becoming more dangerous, the player should be becoming more powerful over the course of a game. And one of the challenges of scaling in this regard is properly pacing the player skill to your enemy and level designs. It's very easy to go too far in one direction. On the player side, if the player becomes too powerful, then they can essentially just breeze through the rest of the game, which in all honesty is not a bad thing. We've talked about this before with the idea of subjective difficulty and what we see in games like Mario Galaxy and the Souls, by the fact that if you get really good at a Souls game, there's not much developers can do for it. They built a very impressive baseline about the Soulsborne. Once you get over that, it's very easy to play, but it requires such a level of expertise and skill, and don't forget practice, to get to that point. Now, on the other side is what happens when the punishment or the difficulties outpace the player's progression. And this is typically seen in RPG or abstracted based titles, where if, let's say, this hand represents the enemies, this hand, there you go, this is the enemies, this is the player. And as the enemies are becoming more powerful, the player is not being given enough tools or skills to compensate. So what ends up happening is that the game becomes more punishing and more troublesome to play, but the player is not being adequately prepared or given means to get around it. One of the good things about Soulsborne, for instance, is that even though as you get later in the enemies become more dangerous, you're getting more souls or echoes from fighting these guys, which means that it becomes easier to repair your gear, replenish your inventory, upgrade your weapons, etc. So even if you do lose 20,000 souls in a fight, if you're in the mid to late game, 20,000 is like a drop in the bucket. In one of the later parts in Bloodborne, it's very easy to get 10,000 echoes in about, I would say maybe like 5 to 10 minutes if you do it right at one of the later areas. And again, earlier in the game, the scale was much lower. When you're first starting out, 1,000 echoes could very much be like 1 million to you. And that's one of the beauty things about scale, is that it always keeps the player and the game design progressively growing. Whether it's, again, in a Diablo game, as you grow in power, as you grow in power, you find new gear, which adds to your repertoire, which makes things easier until you scale the enemies up, and the whole song and dance starts over again. Now, I would really like to get into more detail about player scaling, and we may have to say that for another critical thought, because I can feel myself easily going over 20 minutes if we keep going. But we'll wrap it up here, because again, if I don't stop, who knows what will happen. But to briefly touch again, or to wrap up talking about player scaling, it's important to keep the player's abstracted or their skill in line with the difficulty or the design of the game. Again, it's very hard to keep them both perfectly balanced, and we could arguably say it could be impossible. Even, again, like the Soulsborne series very much fluctuates. But again, figuring out your scale is all about determining the baseline of your title. Again, the bare minimum of what you're expecting out of the player, and then growing things from there. It's always good to do steady or gradual increases of the curve, rather than, again, peaks and valleys. And this goes back to the philosophy of difficulty design as well. You don't want to have a frustratingly difficult section 30% of your way through the game, and then have a final boss that's easy as hell. Natural progression should mean that the game grows harder and everything becomes more powerful over time. And when it comes to scaling in terms of the player's abilities or items and gear, it's important to represent that. If I'm 20% of the way through, I shouldn't be finding a weapon that's going to last me all the way to the end of the game. But that also, once again, gets into another topic about loot and equipment design, especially in games with random or procedurally generated loot. And I think that's actually another topic we have to cover at some point. I should really start to write these all down, or I think I'm going to forget about them. And if I do forget about any of these topics, make sure to give me a sharp poke of a stick in the comments below. But let's wrap it up today. As always, thank you so much once again for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe and all that great stuff. And really, thank you to everyone who is subscribing. And maybe tomorrow we'll have a 1K celebration. Who knows? We may even go over or less. But we'll find out then. So once again, I am Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. This has been today's Critical Thought. Be sure to check out the Twitch stream tonight, and I will see you all tomorrow. Later. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.